What if there was a ticking timer above your head, ticking until your next mistake? The day the countdown clock appeared above people's heads, no one understood what it was counting. The numbers ticked unevenly, for some, minutes, for others, months, for others, years. Scientists debated until they noticed a pattern: the timer reset every time a person made a mistake. Not a fatal one, not necessarily a lethal one. Any mistake. A wrong word, a bad decision, a slip, trusting the wrong person. Mistake became a reference point. And fear. At first, people tried to ignore the timers. They convinced themselves it was another mass hallucination or a temporary lapse in perception. But the numbers were too precise. They sped up before risky decisions and almost stopped when a person hesitated. Mistake was no longer an abstraction, it was approaching, visible. And with every tick, the feeling grew that you were living not by time, but in anticipation of your own mistake. Society changed almost instantly. People began speaking more slowly, walking more carefully, rereading messages 10 times. Mistakes ceased to be part of growth, they became threats. Schools rewrote their curricula, eliminating experiments. Companies banned initiative. Every action required approvals, checks, and safeguards. The world slowed down, but the tension within it only grew. Because the timers were still ticking. Even when you were doing nothing. Very quickly, people noticed another detail. The timer didn't reset after the error was corrected. Apologies, attempts to undo everything, remorse, nothing worked. The countdown started again, as if the world didn't believe in second chances. The error was permanently etched in the fabric, like a scar. This gave rise to a new form of guilt, not for the consequences, but for the very fact of the mistake. People began to fear even thinking about the wrong options. Those appeared whose timers were almost empty. They were called those close to error. People didn't want to work with them, be friends with them, or start families with them. It was believed that being around them increased the risk. No one knew whether error was contagious, but fear was stronger than logic. These people became outcasts even before they had done anything. They were punished in advance, for a future mistake that hadn't yet happened. At the same time, a new cult arose, the cult of infallibility. Its followers believed that a perfect life could freeze the clock forever. They renounced decisions, feelings, and spontaneity. Their days were scheduled down to the second. They ate the same food, walked the same routes, spoke in memorized phrases. Their clocks really did tick slower. But their faces turned blank, as if the price of safety was life itself. Not only action, but also inaction turned out to be a mistake. People who delayed making a choice for too long noticed how the numbers sped up. The world seemed to demand a decision, but punished them for any of it. This contradiction was psychically devastating. Disorders emerged that weren't related to the fear of death, but to the fear of making a mistake. The very concept of choice became toxic. Freedom turned into a trap with a timer. Religions and philosophies offered their own interpretations. Some said the timer was a counter of sins. Others said it was a simulation, a test of perfection. But no theory explained the main thing: why the kindest people sometimes had the shortest timers. This undermined faith in a just world. Mistake ceased to be a moral category. It became random, cold, almost mechanical. Over time, people began to calculate each other. Apps appeared that showed the approximate risk of error based on behavior. Trust became a number. Love, a probability. Friends were chosen not by feelings, but by the stability of the timer. Mistake was no longer personal. It became social currency. The lower your risk, the higher your value. And the greater the fear of one day messing everything up. Only children behaved differently. Their timers often reset, but no one considered it a tragedy. They made mistakes constantly, and laughed. They weren't afraid. Adults looked at them with envy and horror. Because children reminded them, mistakes were once part of learning, not a death sentence. And perhaps humanity's greatest blunder was deciding to fear mistakes more than life itself. Over time, there were people for whom the timer disappeared completely. There was a void above their heads. They were called zeros. No one knew what this meant, either they could no longer make mistakes, or they had already made a complete mistake. People tried to avoid them. The void was more frightening than the numbers. Because the timer at least provided the illusion of control, while the absence of a countdown meant an unknown for which the world was unprepared. Governments quickly brought timers under control. Laws against erroneous risk were introduced. People with short timers were banned from driving, holding leadership positions, and making quick decisions. Error became a legal concept. People were judged not by the consequences, but by the likelihood of a miss. The world became safer on paper, but inside, there was a growing feeling that humanity had voluntarily renounced the right to be imperfect. People began to adjust their lives to the timer, not the other way around. They rejected love if the numbers sped up around a specific person. They didn't have children if they were afraid of making a mistake in raising them. Talented people remained in the shadows because the risk of error was higher for them. The world became gray, but predictable. And in this predictability, everything that had previously made mistakes worthwhile disappeared. Underground communities emerged that deliberately made mistakes. They believed that fear made the timer stronger. These people acted spontaneously, said the first thing that came to mind, and chose the wrong paths. Their timers often reset, but sometimes they froze. No one could explain why. Perhaps the world was reacting not to the error itself, but to the attitude toward it. Scientists finally noticed a strange pattern. The timer sped up most rapidly for those who feared making a mistake. Fear itself became a mistake. Trying to calculate everything led to failure faster than risk. This discovery was terrifying. To slow down the countdown, one had to accept the possibility of failure. But how could the world be persuaded to stop fearing if fear had become the foundation of the entire system? Gradually, the timers began to go crazy. They sped up without apparent cause, reset themselves in their sleep, disappeared for some, and reappeared for others. The system built on control began to crack. People realized that error wasn't a bug, but a part of human nature. And the attempt to eliminate it led to the most massive mistake of all, the abandonment of spontaneity, risk, and freedom. When the timers began disappearing en masse, people experienced not joy, but panic. Without a countdown, they didn't know how to live. Mistakes became invisible again, as before. It turned out that fear was more familiar than freedom. Many tried to recreate timers artificially, inventing new rules and restrictions. Because responsibility without numbers turned out to be more frightening than any countdown. But some perceived the disappearance of timers differently. They began to make mistakes consciously. To learn again. To try, to fall, to rise. Their lives became noisy, uneven, and vibrant. Mistakes returned to their place, as experience, not a death sentence. These people did not become perfect. But they became real. And the world around them began to change, albeit slowly. It turned out that the timer never measured the number of mistakes. It reflected the attitude toward them. The more a person feared failure, the faster the countdown moved. Mistakes became a mirror, not a punishment. And when this was realized, fear began to lose its power. Not immediately. Not for everyone. But enough for the world to stop considering every failure the end. Ultimately, people understood a simple thing: mistakes become fear only when they are allowed to do so. Without mistakes, there is no movement, no growth, no choice. The timer disappeared, but the memory of it remained, a reminder of how easy it is to turn life into an expectation of failure. And how difficult it is to then relearn to live without seeing every step as a potential mistake. The world didn't immediately become a better place after the disappearance of timers. People still looked for numbers out of habit. They waited for signs, confirmations, permission to make mistakes. Many felt a phantom countdown, as if the timer was still ticking, just no longer visible. Fear was deeper than technology. Error no longer had a form, but continued to live in the mind, like a whisper impossible to dismiss. Gradually, people emerged who had never seen timers at all. They were born after their disappearance. For them, mistakes were a normal part of life, unburdened by fear. Older generations looked at them with both anxiety and hope. These children acted boldly, sometimes foolishly, sometimes brilliantly. And it was they who reminded the world what it was like before every step began to count. Over time, it became clear, the disappearance of timers didn't eliminate mistakes, but it restored responsibility. Now, mistakes couldn't be blamed on numbers or a system. Every choice belonged to a person again. This was frightening, but at the same time liberating. Mistakes ceased to be an external judgment and once again became an internal decision, to embrace the experience or remain stuck in fear. People began to re-examine the past. They recalled moments when they abandoned love, dreams, and risks, not because of a real threat, but because of the fear of making a mistake. These memories hurt more than the mistakes themselves. Because it became clear, the most devastating mistake was made when humanity decided that safety was more important than life.